and good day to everyone. My name is Marla Asis. I'm Director of the Scalabrini Migration Center based here in Manila, the Philippines. Welcome and thank you for joining the plenary session on human mobility, climate change, and emergency response. In recent weeks, there has been a spate of reports about climate change-related issues, occasioned perhaps by the run-up to the COP26, Glasgow, Scotland, starting on the 31st of October. In the local front, we recently weathered the force of Typhoon Marin, international name Kumpasu. It left in its wake agricultural losses estimated at 1.2 billion, affecting more than 42,000 farmers, and a death toll of 39. At the global front, the World Health Organization recently released a report which considers climate change as the single biggest threat facing humanity, and it urged governments to take swift action to respond to the unfolding global crisis. An important component of this report is a letter signed by 45 million health workers all over the world. The letter underlined the rapidly growing climate crisis, which could be far more catastrophic and enduring than the COVID-19 pandemic. This conference recognizes the clear, present, and future danger that climate change poses for our common home, and the need to do something about it. Our collective reflection in this conference aims to contribute to the process of crafting meaningful solutions. In this plenary, we take a closer look at the human mobility climate change nexus. This nexus can be examined with human mobility as the cause or driver of climate change. Alternatively, the relationship between the two variables can be examined by framing climate change or environmental change as the driver of human mobility. Our two expert speakers will share with us how this complex nexus plays out in the Pacific Islands. Migration, both internal and international, is significant in the Pacific Islands. Long before the migration and development nexus became an item in the global agenda, migration, circulation, and remittances had been part of the way of life in this part of the world. In the 1980s, several Pacific Island countries came to be known as treading the MIRAB, M-I-R-A-B, model of development. It is a development spurred by migration, remittances, aid, and bureaucracy. Decades later, observers note that the underlying MIRAB-based economic structure remains a strong feature of Pacific Island countries. The Pacific Islands have also received much attention in global discussions on the mitigation and adaptation to climate change. The region is a site of rapid or onset events, such as floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, which give rise to frequent displacements, but also as home to island states and the largest number of atolls. The threat of sea level rise is a grave concern. Some of the Pacific Island countries are also grappling with other slow onset events, such as drought. These environmental processes impact the life and livelihood of the people in this region, which could lead to various forms of migration. Presently, there is a growing body of knowledge about drivers of human mobility and climate change, as well as evolving policies and practices in the region. And we will hear about these from our experts. And so we begin. I think there's going to be a change of order. First, we begin with a presentation of Mr. Nacanieli Speigth. Mr. Speigth is the project manager in the programs team focusing on climate and disaster-induced displacement in the Pacific. He joined the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre in 2019 after 8 years of serving with the United Nations Development Program Pacific Office, designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating environmental climate change adaptation and risk governance projects in over 10 countries in the Pacific. He worked as advisor to the chief negotiator when Fiji presided over the UN Climate Conference in 2017-2018 and spent a short stint with the British High Commission in Fiji to strengthen regional engagement in the Pacific. He holds a joint Master of Science in Environmental Sciences, Policy and Management from the Central European University, University of Manchester, and Lund University. Joining us from Fiji, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Speigth.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Just give me a second to try and share my screen with the participants. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all those tuning in from within the Philippines, and good afternoon from Suva, Fiji. It is a pleasure to join you this morning on behalf of my director, Ms. Alexandra Bilak, and the organization that I represent at this very timely event, as the moderator have already alluded to, as the world looks forward to what COP26 will deliver on this very important issue. In my talk this morning, I will be focusing most on the nexus of internal displacement, climate change and disasters, shedding some light on some of our recent findings, as you might have already read in our flagship 2021 Global Report on Internal Displacement. I'm going to also share with you some of the ongoing analysis on the Asia-Pacific region. And at the end, I'll outline some of the actions necessary to bridge the science policy divide, and also some of the best practices from our ongoing work in the Pacific. But before I go into the gist of my presentation, let me share some brief on IDMC as an organization, which is, we started off in 1998. It's a global center of multidisciplinary experts that monitors and report on the situation of people being displaced within their own countries, or IDPs. We are mandated under the UN resolution to collect reliable, timely, longitudinal, and disaggregated data and the impact of protracted displacement on host communities to improve policy, programming, prevention, and response. We track and monitor displacement data using a multitude of sources. We analyze drivers, patterns, and impacts before reporting it in the form of our flagship publication that I've already mentioned. Avoid any confusion, IDMC does not collect primary data on internal displacement, but relies on the data collected by a wide range of partners on the ground, including IFRC, OCHA, UNOCHA, IOM, but also from governments such as DROMIC or other sources, including the media. Despite our best efforts, we do not yet paint a very comprehensive picture of internal displacement worldwide, but our global baseline is still an underestimate. So bear that in mind as I go through the presentation today. Disaster is a global reality and an everyday occurrence. Over the past decade, disaster occurrences have become a major driver of displacements. As you can see in the figure, it is quite clear that disaster figures pretty much has overtaken conflict-driven displacement globally. In 2020, based on the 2021 report that we released earlier this year in May, there's about 30.7 million internal displacement that were triggered by disasters in 2020 alone. To give you a more clearer picture, there's about from the 30.7 million that were driven by disasters, 30 million were weather related, and around 655,000 were geophysical. To unpack that further, flooding amounts to the major, to about 49% of displacement, which means that flooding did cause 49% of displacement globally, followed by storms. And as you would note, that 2020 was a year of relentless storms all across the Asia-Pacific region. Then wildfires, droughts, and so forth. But let me make this point clear. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of weather-related hazard, but it is not the only factor that drives displacement risk. I say this in recognition of the fact that we're dealing with an issue that is so complex and so interconnected that we often run with the assumption that climate change is causing a lot of this movement of people. And this is why IDMC as an organization have to provide this necessary unpacking of these nuances. So quite recently, we've developed this typology of the different effects of trying to understand how each of the climate change impacts leads to the drivers of displacement that we now know globally. So as you can see, loss of territory drives displacement, sudden onset hazards, such as tropical cyclones, such as landslide, such as flooding, they drive a lot of internal displacement. Food and water insecurity, loss of livelihoods are all factors that drive displacement. But all these are also driven by climate change effects. As you can see, if you follow the lines, it leads you to the main drivers of internal displacement. This helps us to then determine whether any form of internal displacement is driven by climate change and which aren't. When we talk about disaster displacement, we basically are dealing with both the sudden onset events and also the slow onset events. When you talk about disaster displacement, we also follow the different phase, the three phases of any disaster management cycle. Displacement, we do acknowledge that displacement happens during preparedness and early warning phase. So people are asked to move to a safer place before any event occurs, if any disaster risk is looming. During the emergency phase, immediately when the disaster strikes, and also during recovery and reconstruction phase. We also, to monitor these specific indicators that we had to employ in order to effectively account for the number of movement of people during these different phases of disasters. We also do this to address some of the most critical misconceptions that have serious implications on people, policy, and responses to address the risk of displacement. There's often a misunderstanding that disaster displacement is short-term, while we know for a fact that growing evidence shows that it can easily become protracted with significant social and economic impacts. There's also a misconception on it affects all people in similar ways. Well, in reality, different groups experience different impacts. Small-scale events are not major concern. In fact, we know that they have a significant relative impact on individuals and threaten local development gains. Disaster displacement can be understood and addressed in a compartmentalized way, chronologically and by sector. Because of its complication, it needs to be understood that converging drivers and compounding events actually mean that such responses can generate new risks if we sectoralize it. Only people forced from their homes suffer the negative impacts, another misunderstanding. But in fact, those who remain in place can be equally affected, in some instances even considered displaced. So, and also most countries only collect data on the displacement disaster trigger in the immediate aftermath, which is a major challenge for us in trying to provide scientific evidence to inform government policymakers and also those who are acting to address this risk with a lot of challenges. So for IDMC, this slide basically shows the processes that we follow in order to produce the evidence that government and other stakeholders needed in our ongoing work in the Asia-Pacific region. So we collect data, as I mentioned before, compile it from different assessments, surveys, registration data, media and satellite imagery, and we run all these analyses. We do triangulate it with stakeholders at national level before we actually publicize it. And those basically are different sources of information that are that you've seen from our global analysis, and I'll go deeper into the regional analysis in the next few minutes. But one thing you have to note that While we also look into slow onset events, drought impacts are often excluded from our displacement estimates because of the difficulty in quantifying these slow onset events. And we constantly are working on coming up with different means and mediums of monitoring drought-driven or drought-induced displacement. More closer to home, in our ongoing analysis, those are in terms of new displacement in the last decade. China tops it, with the Philippines becoming number 2 in terms of countries that are affected by disasters, where this internal displacement are basically driven by disasters. And when we look at it, most of these displacement are recorded during the monsoon season. And I do sincerely share my condolences to the 39 families that have lost their lives in the recent event. And we also know that most of this movement of people are happening during cyclone season in Southern Asia and typhoon season in East Asia and the Pacific. When we look into the region, again, it's very consistent. Flooding is the major driver of displacement in our region, and followed by storms, so forth. Zooming into the Philippines, and you can easily find this in the Philippine country profiles, we can definitely see that disaster again is the major driver of internal displacement in the Philippines. Through research, we are finding out that poverty and rapid and unregulated urbanization in hazard-prone areas are major drivers of disaster displacement risk in the Philippines. While the archipelago is also highly exposed to recurrent hydrometeorological and geophysical hazards, including storms, floods, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and drought. It experiences an average of 20 tropical storms a year, and I stand to be corrected, mainly between June and September, of which an average of 5 are very destructive. Floods take place primarily during the southwest monsoon season, which basically drives a lot of displacement. We also noted that IDPs living in prolonged displacement and unable to return are often relocated to transitional shelters so that they can meet their medium-term housing needs. The major challenge IDP face are mostly to do with securing safe, durable housing, access to basic services such as education, and generating income despite the lack of livelihood opportunities in the area of displacement. While displaced individuals are still struggling to get back to normalcy, the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated their situation. And as a result of local lockdowns, displaced communities experience movement restrictions, but without proper protective mechanism in place in their camps. I guess the same applies to IDPs displaced by conflict in all instances as well. When we look into the future, from a global analysis, and it's quite similar as well to the future risk of displacement in the Philippines, where earthquake, flooding, storm surge, tsunami, cyclonic are estimated to be the future drivers of displacement in the Philippines. And when we talk about future drivers, you're looking at 20 to 50 years time. Also, the model is telling us that when we look into the 1.5 report, the IPCC 1.5 report, and we look at the different scenarios, it shows when we model the risk of displacement given different scenarios, new assessments show that we can expect a 50% increase in displacement risk related to floods for each degree of temperature increase. So that's just some of the recent findings, and we continue to do this for other hazards as well. So what are some of the actions? We'd like to put across here that building on existing mechanism, building on existing action is an economical and effective way forward in strengthening local systems. So we've often speak to this it's already on across a lot of our publication. There's some of the things that we can learn from the Philippines, some of the local action that we can learn from the Philippines, preemptive evacuation centers because of the really early warning system that is in place. It can be looked at as a cause of displacement, but it really saves lives and reduces the impacts of disasters. The work of the Disaster Response Operations Monitoring and Information System is one of the most reliable national systems in Asia for data on displacement associated with both disasters and conflict. And this is something that we've always referred to when we look into our work in other parts of the world and also in the region. But one thing is certain, that this issue, because of its complexity and in its multi-sectoral impacts, we have to take an integrated approach. And this is what our work in the Pacific is really focusing on, and I hope it will seed some thought in terms of looking ahead in addressing this particular issue. Why do we need to look into an integrated approach? As I said, it is a complex and multi-causal issue. Development drives displacement risk, and displacement also provides the opportunity to build back better and safeguard development investment. There are established and existing mechanisms, so let's avoid reinventing the wheel. Competing agendas at national and regional level, including SDGs, implementation of the Paris Agreement, makes sense of why we need to integrate. Most of our government, especially in the Pacific, have small workforce, and therefore overlapping roles. Addressing displacement is only financially attractive during the response phase, so an integrated approach is needed to ensure that we have incentive for investment even during prevention and also during recovery phase. So those are some of the practices in the region. In our current IDMC project, Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement, we are looking into existing regional repository and databases, ensuring that there is a displacement mechanism, a displacement repository integrated into the regional data repository. We're working with SPC through the Pacific Resilience Nexus that is yet to be established to ensure that disaster displacement monitoring, analysis, and data are integrated into national portals in Fiji and Vanuatu are being looked at as well. IDMC is also improving its risk modeling so that it can also be a tool that can be adopted in existing local systems as well. When we look into policies, the framework for resilient development in the Pacific provide an innovative and also effective mechanism to foster collaboration and cooperation at regional and national level, not only for government, but also for partners that are involved in this space. We also are looking through our ongoing work, we integrated the need for risk assessment into National Adaptation Plan, into X, the Tonga Emergency Bill, into different planning frameworks such as the recovery strategy for Vanuatu, COVID-19 handle, the Marshall Islands National Adaptation Plan, and also introducing tools that guides government and local actors on how to integrate the need for good risk assessment, the need for addressing and considering the concerns of internally displaced populations. When we look into capacity, we are integrating it into the existing cluster mechanism that is introduced into many of these Pacific Island countries and being adopted as well. And the need for cluster mechanism, as initially thought out, was to strengthen the capacity of government. And this is where we are also introducing the monitoring capacity, strengthening them, equipping them with tools, equipments that would help them to ensure that they monitor disaster displacement in the different countries and regions. I'll stop there for now and happy to also respond to any questions that might come up. So Pär will also go deeper into the some of the introductory work of both IOM and IDMC in the Pacific. So I'll leave it to him for now before I take on any question in relation to the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasa. And also thank you for keeping to the time. Actually, even if the focus is supposed to be on emergency response, the discussion of Mr. Speigth covers the entire range, no? From the emergency response to the more long-term and durable actions that are needed. We very much appreciate your sharing with us about the work of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, because it's a very important source of information and insights about internal displacements, especially those and identifying to us the various types of displacements that have been happening in different parts of the world, but very much highlighting, no, the significance of disasters and the significance of climate change and environment change related displacements throughout the world. So we are also very happy to note that you mentioned in your presentation some of the lessons and some of the good practices that you have recognized as coming from the Philippines. And what this highlights to us also is really the need for dialogue and exchange so that we can learn from each other, considering that this is a very complex issue that we are facing. We turn now to the second speaker. While Mr. Speigth talked about internal displacements, we turn our focus to the possibility of cross-border displacements that could happen. Our resource speaker is Mr. Pär Liljert. He is the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration in Australia and Coordinator for the Pacific. Prior to taking up his current post, he served in various countries. From 2013 to 2018, he was IOM's Special Envoy and Chief of Mission in China. And before that, he was Chief of Mission in Tanzania and Chief of Mission in Zambia. He played an important role in establishing IOM's Africa Capacity Building Center in Tanzania. Joining us from Canberra, Australia, please let us welcome Mr. Pär Liljert.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm just checking that you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, you're okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you all this morning. I'm very honored to be given this opportunity to be with you today. My presentation following Natha's excellent presentation already will review the impacts of climate change and human mobility in the Pacific region. And I will try to reflect on some of the trends that we are seeing, the key challenges and priorities of the national governments in the Pacific, and also to highlight some of the challenges. And I will close by reviewing a couple of potential responses and IOM activities. So if I could have the next slide, please. I will begin by just a very brief overview of the Pacific Islands for those of you that might not be so familiar with the Pacific region. The Pacific region is basically made up of three major groups of islands divided into what we call the Melanesia group, the Micronesia group, and the Polynesia group. There is a huge diversity, and this is important to recognize. While there is similarities amongst the countries in many ways, there are also a huge diversity in the region, from the sort of microstates with a population of around 10,000 people to larger countries with, Papua New Guinea, for example, with 7.9 million. And the region has a diversity of resources, of cultures, of languages, etc. And also in terms of the availability of land. And of course, with that comes the vulnerability to climate change and disaster. And as you all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report has outlined with high confidence that the small island states will face extreme risks even within the 1.5 degree of global warming. And this range from sea level rise, from water stress and marine ecosystems, And the recent reports also note that migration and relocation will be increased due to, or will be increased as a adaptation strategy. So in the Pacific, the rate of sea level rise that we're seeing is projected to be higher than in other parts of the world, and naturally also with higher impacts on the countries. And it's projected that it will raise from 40 to 80 centimeters by the end of this century. So we can go to the next slide, please. And now, how does these climate change impact affects the mobility? Well, while the environment has always been an important driver of mobility, and mobility has always been a strategy to cope with an advanced environment. However, with climate change, it's predicted that pre-existing drivers of mobility will potentially contributing to the new emerging challenges in the context of climate mobility. And we can categorize these types of mobility as migration, or predominantly voluntarily movements, or displacement as forced movements, such as occurring due to sudden onset disasters and planned relocation, which at this stage mainly occurs internally. So we're predominantly at this stage looking at internal movements. Next slide, please. So if we're now looking at the different migration trends in the Pacific, migration in a way is as facet as the Pacific identity that I outlined in the earlier slide. It's evident that people are used to moving. This has happened during all times. Those living on smaller islands, they have been moving to bigger ones to access services. People make daily commutes from rural to urban areas, for example, for work, for services like school and hospitals. They are centralized, which means that people live in the cities for the week and return home over the weekends. So movement, in a way, has been a natural part of the history of the Pacific for a very, very long time, since the early days. But these very temporary movements are becoming more permanent. That's what we're seeing. So internal migration is taking place at a rapid pace, from smaller other islands to larger central islands, or from rural to urban areas, leading to high rates of urbanization and centralization. Countries like Nauru, Palau, Marshall Islands, they all have urban populations of higher than 70%. Fiji and Samoa have approximately 50% of their population living in urban centers. So it's a very high percentage. And international migration also takes place across Pacific routes, either within the Pacific or to other countries such as Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and other countries further away. Next slide, please. Just to address a couple of the drivers of this movements within the Pacific. Migration is driven by a range of drivers, naturally, and as in other parts of the world, the Pacific Islanders would move because of the environment, employment, and a host of other reasons. In the field of research that we have been doing, people rarely explicitly note that climate change is a key reason to migrate. We have sort of had to dig a bit deeper in order to sort of observe that this actually is an underlying reason. So climate change is an underlying reason for movement. As such, the search for employment and greener pastures, access to services and poverty are all proxies of climate change effects. And another important observation that might be important to highlight here is the role played by what we call immigration regimes. So of the Pacific countries, that would be in terms of determining the selection of destination countries of where migrants would go for cross-border movements. And it's very clear and I guess natural and understandable that the Pacific Islanders would choose countries on the basis of their privileged right to enter and stay as citizens. So for example, for countries and territories such as Tokelau and Niue and Cook Islands, they would first choice would be New Zealand in terms of a destination, while Micronesian countries and like Marshall Islands, etc., they would prefer the US as they can enter and work there for unlimited periods. And seasonal workers, sort of temporary workers, that would predominantly choose countries again where there are labor mobility schemes, for example, to the New Zealand and Australia. Can move to the next slide, please. This is actually a slide with data that we have borrowed from NAFA and the IDMC colleagues, and it just shows the sort of overview of the Pacific disaster displacement from 2008 to 2020. And it's just to give you an overview of the displacement in the extended Pacific region, which then would include Australia and New Zealand, etc. And it's a fairly large number. And again, if you take into account the, for some countries, fairly small population, it is actually a very big impact when it comes to the displacement. Predominantly, as I said before, this is of course internal displacement. We can move to next slide. So in the context of the situation with rising sea levels, countries that have carried out planned relocations, and I think NAFA touched upon this in his presentation, for example, in Fiji and Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, most of these planned relocations, as we refer to them, takes place in the context of severe coastal erosion and inundations due to high tides, the destruction from cyclones, as well as volcanic eruptions in the Pacific Islands. Mostly this would involve internal relocation over short distances, connected through, again, as I outlined earlier, the important aspects of tradition, culture, and economic factors. And an important observation, I guess, in this context is that the host and relocated communities should be consulted in order to ensure that the relocation is successful in its specific context of the Pacific, where the ties to the land plays such an important role, stronger than in most other cultures, at least that I have witnessed around the world. This is something that can both make the planned relocation a success, but can also become a very big challenge if it's not planned properly. Next slide, please. So just two slides that I will show you in terms of outlining the key challenges in the Pacific related to climate mobility, and touched upon many of them already, so I'm not going to go into too much of the details. But if we would sort of say, what are the implications of human mobility in the context of climate change and disasters in the Pacific region, and what are the key national priorities for the governments? Well, here is a list of some of the key issues that we have highlighted. And it's not only based on IOM findings, but on findings that we have done together with all the partners. And based on the several regional consultations and dialogues that we have had in different programs, for example, together with IDMC and other partners, but also within the joint UN programs on climate change and human mobility, there is an inexhaustive list of key challenges that are faced by the countries. Again, aspects such as culture and identity, loss of land, loss of livelihood are really key challenges in the Pacific context, and very, in my experience at least, very unique in a way to how the culture and land rights are present within the Pacific history and its culture. Can go to the next one, please. In order to try to address these diverse challenges and try to assist the national governments and the regional bodies that are working on these issues together with us in the Pacific, I guess we can ask ourselves, what are the potential responses to address any of these issues, and what kind of impacts can be categorized as a response. Well, if I am to outline a couple of them, one of the key one that we see is to help people to stay and to minimize the risk for forced migration. So that's the key message. And by trying to do that, we would do it through actions under disaster risk reduction, what we call DRR, and climate change adaptations policies, CCAs. It's important to, at the same time, facilitate for voluntary movements and enhance the migration management, including through support of labor migration and immigration schemes, as I referred to earlier. But it's also important to highlight that some of those would probably need to go through some policy revision in order to actually address more longer term, so that it doesn't become only a temporary movement. And finally, we need to try to help the Pacific people that are on the move, and try to manage the displacement through emergency and humanitarian operations. Move to the next one. I just wanted to outline a specific program that IOM is implementing in the Pacific together with a range of UN and non-UN partners. And this is to empower communities affected by climate change and disasters in the Pacific region, focusing on climate change and disaster-related migration, displacement, and planned relocation. And this project, which is called the Pacific Climate Change, Migration and Human Security Project, is led by IOM, but involves ILO, SGAP, OHCHR, the UN Agency on Human Rights, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and also non-UN agencies like PDD, the Platform for Disaster Displacement. It covers the 14 countries in the Pacific region, so it has a regional, fully regional scope, but also works very closely at the national and community level. So this program, in terms of the main objectives, firstly, it's to support the Pacific governments to strengthen capacity and coordination to address climate-related mobility. Secondly, supporting migrants and communities that are affected, who already are seeing voluntarily migration, to benefit from migration and to enable their families to leverage this migration as a way to adapt to climate change. The theory of change is really that by supporting enhanced migration governance, migration can ultimately benefit sustainable development and climate change adaptations. And the last objective that this project is trying to achieve is to contribute to an evidence-based good practices to address issues related to climate change and disaster through migration, displacement, and planned relocation, as mentioned earlier. And this particularly supports the regional and the national policies, and the program is really developed around the existing policies and try to strengthen them even further, but to be more, I guess, at the practical level, including at the community. So we can go to the next slide. In terms of just to share some updates on what is going on in terms of the regional framework discussions with the Pacific countries, where we are looking at addressing climate-related mobility and potentially even in situation of cross-border movements in the future. So we're undertaking consultations at the moment with Pacific governments at the regional and national level to understand the impacts of climate change and mobility and identify opportunities for further collaboration. So this would be the next phase of the program that I mentioned earlier, and to make it fully integrated into the regional processes like the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. And we also would like to inform this framework in a way by undertaking national consultations across the Pacific, government ministries with civil society organizations and community groups, so that the policies and the regional framework will actually be based on not only the national policies, but also the engagement of the civil society and the community. Coming towards the end of my presentation, but just a few more slides. I believe that the next slide, Natha from IDMC already touched upon most of the activities that is happening within the Pacific Response to Disaster Displacement project, which is led by IDMC, where IOM is one of the partners. But maybe just quickly to outline that under this project, IOM is working with disaster management authorities, what we in many countries refer to as the NDMOs, to develop nationally owned capacities to collect and analyze data on displacement caused by disasters, strengthen the government response mechanisms, and enable wider and broader understanding on how displacement policies should be broadly included into national development pathways. This is, of course, with the objective to have access to even stronger data than what we currently have, and to be able to, together with IDMC and other partners, really have an evidence-based approach to disaster displacement. What happens after you have been displaced? Where do you end up? Do you go back to where you used to live? Do you go to a new location? And what reasons is there behind that movement? And is it temporarily, or is it permanent? So that is what we're working on with the partners under that program. And if I can ask for the next slide, which is the second last one, it is again just to outline a couple of issues in terms of what we have done together with IDMC and other partners under the program, or for example, to draft a set of standard operating procedures, what we call SOPs, for the national disaster management offices in the different countries, to adopt towards developing nationally owned displacement tracking capacities. Vanuatu, I think, is a very good example of this. We have also rolled out community vulnerability disaster displacement assessments in most of the countries. And we are collaborating with local partners to map and assess the evacuation centers, for example, across Tonga, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And I will close by the last slide, and just to, in closing, maybe share one or two additional points, and that is, while climate change is affecting mobility trends world over, the urgency to address these adverse impacts is significant in the Pacific region, particularly as they place existential threats to the entirety of some low-lying islands, as we all know. The potential responses must really ensure that mobility and immobility is a choice, a free choice, and that those displaced are protected, while those moving have adequate means to benefit from their migration. And at the same time, we also are working with national level to ensure that governments are equipped with the tools and skills to manage displacement responses, creating pathways for management of cross-border movements, which we foresee would happening more in the future. So thank you so much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to share these thoughts and for the attention of the participants in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pär. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. And actually, your last statements, I think, were a very good synthesis of what you had presented. And I think I would just like to highlight a few things from what you had mentioned. And that is that while displacement is always a possibility, and one of the adaptation strategies to climate change, I think both in your presentations, also it came out in Natha's presentation as well, that migration is actually one of various strategies in terms of adapting to the impacts of climate change. But I think what both of you have also highlighted is the fact that we have to work as much in giving people a choice, so that staying where they are is also a very important option that people can have. And I think one thing that's quite interesting, Pär, in your presentation is your mention of the need to protect tradition, identity, and culture, even as we think about the various strategies of adapting to climate change, and also with the possibility of people engaging in different types of movements. I think it would be good to give our participants a chance to ask questions to our experts and also to share in the discussion. So I would just like to ask our CIFAL team if there are any questions from the floor. If not, maybe I can start with a question to both of you, to both Pär and Natha. And I was wondering, what is the sentiment of people in the Pacific Islands about the possibility of climate change impinging more on their lives, and what do they think about prospects like relocation? You had mentioned that there are already some planned relocation that is underway in some countries, and if you could speak about what do people think about this option?
Natha, do you want to go first, or?
Yes, I'll reflect on some of my project that Pär had alluded to, and then I'll probably give it to him, because IOM is leading on the community vulnerability assessment. And probably this is, I guess, a perfect opportunity to probably bring out some of those engagement, the community perception. But from my side, on the other aspect, on the policy stream, as well as the data and evidence stream of the project that we currently co-partner with IOM here in the Pacific region, movement in most of the policy document has always been as the last resort. It's always articulated. That's quite common because of the sensitivity. People are quite, in the Pacific, our culture is still intact. And there's always this hesitation to move because of the close ties to the land and to the totems, the cultural totems, and so forth. As we've heard already from Pär in terms of the context of migration and climate mobility in the region. For instance, in Tonga, it's when we start consulting about internal displacement, it was quite sensitive. To say the least, they don't even want to talk about it, and that's a different dynamics altogether. Fiji, it's quite progressive. Vanuatu, it's quite progressive. Different countries have different way of approaching it, and there's different tags to it as well. And that's basically quite the general feel about it, but. Dr. Assis, the situation in the Pacific, there is a climate crisis, and there is no option but to really, for government, the challenge is with government now to really consult with communities and really explain to them that, this is the only option you have, and to really maneuver the way around the cultural sensitivity of things. So it's like I said, talking about this issue is quite complex. It has a lot of deep buried issues that we need to address. One of it is really the governance and making sure that communities are part and parcel of the process, not when they move, but from the start, the planning process. From the start, when you're doing assessment, when you're doing risk assessment, that's when they need to be involved, and they need to know the end game of it. Not just we need to gain a lot of data from you, but really where is this data going to lead into? So that's. I'll stop there, and really basically Pär would want to add on to that from the community vulnerability assessment. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nath. I think you did very well in addressing that very challenging question. I think that just to emphasize again that as Nath also mentioned, that it's very clear, and I think this is not unique to the Pacific, that people do not want to leave their land. And it's stronger in the Pacific, as we keep on saying, than probably in other parts of the world. What we're seeing from the discussions with the communities at the community level is that there is more, as I try to emphasize in the presentation, awareness of the fact, since their land is being, in a way, affected and will be uninhabitable. There is an understanding and awareness in the communities, more so probably than at the national level, to be honest, that this is something that they will need to face. The challenge, I think, is really that in order to make relocation successful, it needs to be planned. While it is very difficult to discuss it, especially at the community level, until you are very close to having to move. So it's a paradox in itself that nobody wants to talk about it. You're aware, but you don't want to talk about it until the very close time that you realize that there is no return. I have to move. But then it's very difficult to make it planned. And that is, I think, where the discussions at the community is so important, and it will take time. It is not so that, as mentioned by Natha, in some of the countries, this will have a short-term solution. But the important issue is that these relocations are really planned and that the communities are well aware of where they're going. Ideally, they should even, be involved in the process. And that's what we're trying to do. But you don't do that in a year or two. You have to spend somewhat more time on it. So I think I will leave it there. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we have several questions, but I think we don't have enough time. So perhaps we can address, let's try to address one question. And what we can do with the other questions is we will forward them to you and then we will share them, I think, in the Facebook of CIFAL, no, for your responses. So let me just read out this one question that's posed by one of our participants. What measures can local and national governments do in order to ensure that we have regular pathways, migration pathway, that we have regular migration pathways for climate migrants? Pär, would you like to start with that?
I would love to, but it's a big question. So the risk is that I will go a little bit for too long. So I will try to be brief. But this is really the cracking nut that we need to have more discussions for a longer term approach to migration pathways.
Okay, yeah.
So for example, when we're looking at current labor mobility schemes that exist for workers in the Pacific, they are very, very successful, in fact. They're very successful. There are issues, but they're very successful. But it doesn't today provide opportunities for a longer term migration pathway. So while instead what it actually does is they might separate families for a longer time, but the migrant worker is always requested to return back. It's not allowed to stay in some of the countries where they have been working. They are not allowed to bring family members. And those are the key issues that we need to start discussing in order to address a longer term migration pathway for the Pacific and provide other opportunities in the long run that goes beyond. And we also need to look at migration pathways between countries in the Pacific, which today is limited in terms of options and discussions. But that is about the issue of addressing identity. You know, how would I identify myself if I move to another country? How can I maintain the identity that I have, the culture that I have? And of course, issues around participating in elections and so forth as well. How can I cast my vote? So that's it's a big question, but it's a very interesting one, and we're starting to take small steps, I think, together with the countries in the approach of putting this very, very big question on the agenda, because it's being realized that sooner or later it needs to have a longer term migration pathways than just the temporary ones. I will leave it there. Over.
Hello, Mr. Pär and Mr. Natha, and our participants. I think Dr. Marla Assis was disconnected, but let me just get quickly to some of the questions as well. We have another question, and this is in relation to the experiences or maybe some data trends. What are some data trends that you can share with us regarding okay. I think Dr. Marla is here. I'll hand it over to her. Dr. Marla?
Sorry about that. No, I don't know if it was my computer that was the problem. Yeah, but so can we, sorry about the interruption. So perhaps we can resume. Kat, I think both Pär and Natha are muted.
Yes, Dr. Marla.
You have finished, sorry. Sorry about that. So it's me, it's my connection who's the which has the problem. I apologize for that. And I think because also for the next activity that that it's scheduled, I think it's time for us to wrap up with this plenary session. And I would just like to thank our experts for sharing their insights with us. And I think we have many takeaways that we can reflect on even after this session. But perhaps one thing that I would just like to say by way of ending this session is to underscore also the need for discussions among states, especially regional cooperation, which is one of the to-dos that is highlighted by the Global Compact of Migration. And even as we have already gained some data and some insights, as well as some good practices, learning some good practices along the way, I believe that one of the basic things that still needs to be done is really to also improve the data on displacement, and particularly internal displacement. And I think also in relation to that, and I hope that both our speakers will agree, that perhaps there's also a need to revisit the guidelines for internal displacement, because when the guidelines were developed in the 1990s, the guidelines were very sensitive to conditions conditions of conflict that lead to displacement. But we now have a lot of experiences concerning displacements that have been occasioned by climate change and environment-related changes. So we also need to take that into account. And so with that, again, thanks very much to Pär and to Natha, and thanks to our participants for your participation in this plenary session. We will see you in the next session, which is the World Cafe. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.